Welcome to everyone in the Bull Oak community for round 9 of the Paddock the Goals Flood Recovery Series, brought to you by the Bull Oak Shire Council in partnership today with Roland Media, North Central League, North Central Catchment Authority and the Mallybunker Cafe, with funding support, of course, from the state and federal government Community Recovery Program, coordinated by the amazing team at Emergency Recovery Victoria. My name is Jo Postlethwaite and I am the Manager of Community Recovery in the Bull Oak Shire Council, and I will be your host today. We'd like to begin with acknowledging our traditional owners of the land from which we are broadcasting today and extend our respects to elders past, present and emerging. It's bound to be dewy on the turf for our finals coming up today. With a cool start, we're looking at a top of 15 degrees as we head to Lord Nelson Park at St Arnaud for round 3 of the finals. Good luck to all the teams today who are not just fighting it out, but to take their place in the North Central League Grand Final next week. This round we look forward to how we're getting out the microscope to look more deeply into our community fabric in terms of our topography and also what brings us together and holds us together. We hope you're listening in today from your car at the North Central League football, netball or hockey, or if you're not a footy fan, perhaps you can tune in from home, on the couch, listen to a podcast travelling in the car, wherever you are. You can also catch us and our past episodes by visiting Council's website at bullock.vic.gov.au. So let's bounce that ball for the first quarter and introduce our guests from the North Central Catchment Management Authority, Manager of Floodplain, Camille White. Welcome to you.
Hi there, Jo.
It's great to have you on board. And also from the Bull Oak Shire Council, our Senior Flood Recovery Manager, Dan McLaughlin. Hello to you also.
How you going, Jo?
Fantastic. Okay, Dan, so chain of command is very important when it comes to emergency management, and we were very well led by the Incident Controller and other agencies such as the North Central Catchment Management Authority in providing that strategic direction. How important was this close collaboration in mitigating those impacts of flooding last year?
Really important, Jo. It was obviously my first emergency as a MIMO, so Municipal Emergency Management Officer for Council. So I was very much learning on the run. No training provides for what really happens. So the incident controller is very much in charge, and our role as a council is certainly to provide information, feed information back in to that incident control centre, and work with agencies such as the Catchment Authority to make sure that we're advising where possible the best information back into that system.
Fantastic. Now, Camille, you had some interesting involvement with us. You did a bit of flying around. Could you perhaps take us back to and have some reflections upon your moments in Bull Oak and how you helped actually coordinate our flood recovery efforts and mitigating those floods at that time?
Yeah, sure. So my role is day-to-day is the manager of floodplain, but during an emergency I get deployed to the Incident Control Centre and support SES to help understand what the floodwaters might do. So how it works is the Bureau of Meteorology predict how high water will get. Our role in the Incident Control Centre, we call ourselves flood analysts, so technical specialists. We sort of then tell them what that means on ground. How wide is it going to be? So the Bureau is how high, we say how wide. So that helps us. What we've done, obviously, back in 2011 and 2010, we had very poor information. Since then, we've done a lot of flood studies. We've got a lot more better information that we can help advise, what are the potential impacts during a flood event. So, yeah, look, honestly, that flood that we had last year really showed that no two floods are the same. That flood event in October was actually the second highest on record on the Avoca River system on record. So it was actually higher than the September 2010 event. And in that September 2010 event, there was over 80 properties in Charlton that had overflow flooding. And hats off to the, emergency service, in particular council, working with the local community, because works have happened since to reduce that impact. So, my understanding was nowhere near as that big, was it, Dan, in Charlton itself? So it was a lot of great work that was done to reduce the impacts in Charlton that could have been really bad.
Absolutely. And thank you. Look, it was really a grassroots effort, and I think the way that we're addressing things now is really going to where our people are and really listening into our community very closely so that we have a lot more information from which to make really important decisions. Dan, can you tell us about some examples where this coordinated effort and consultative action helped to engage the community, and where were some of these really important communications you had?
Yeah, so I guess the most celebrated one, Joe, is the one that is the Charlton instance that Camille's touched on. So there was only one house, potentially two structures with water overflow, which is a really good result. And that work was really achieved by listening to community, particularly out on the back St. Arnold Road. So local landowners like Joe Thompson and Gav Sate feeding that local knowledge back to council representatives, and then council representatives working with Camille and other analysts in the control centre to really just encourage the natural water flow back into the natural overflows around the community of Charlton. And yeah, it was it's certainly a success, and certainly something we will build on now when we look at further or updating flood studies, I guess, and updating survey. We'll certainly look to put some of those measures, some of those temporary measures in that response phase recommended by the community into place in a permanent way.
Terrific. Camille, most people at home probably don't quite understand how the Catchment Management Authority coordinated across the municipalities and regions, that you had quite a lot of work to do in this space, especially when a number of regions are impacted by floods. Can you take us through how that information is shared and the decisions are made, especially with regard to flood prevention and mitigation?
Yeah, so a lot of the work is done actually before the flood event, rather than we try and do that before the event rather than waiting to the event. Things like what we have is a regional floodplain management strategy for the entire region. There's actually 3 catchment management authorities that are across the Bullock Shire. There's ourselves, Mallee Catchment Management Authority, and then the Wimmera Catchment Management Authority that looks after that Wimmera catchment. So they're a smaller group, but obviously the Bullock Shire is largely shared between ourselves and Mallee CMA, and we have regional flood strategies, and they prioritise actions across the region. So it's not necessarily council versus council competing, it's just highlighting what are the highest priorities to improve floodplain management in the region. And we've been quite successful in our region to get funding to help councils achieve a lot of those recommendations. But obviously the flood event last year highlighted a lot more that can be done as well. And we've worked with Bullock Shire to identify some of those actions, and we've updated our regional flood strategy as well to include those actions. Something simple like obviously we know in Donald the gates there. If we can do some sort of automated thing, fingers crossed. The funding is available for that, but also things like updating flood studies, because obviously with climate changes and changes to the landscape, things need to be updated.
Absolutely. And probably something further than that is you really have to sort of work towards sometimes a worst case scenario. I did hear about some locals who kind of went out onto the levee banks and were almost willing it to come up, where the water to come up higher, just to test out the levee. But we're very grateful that it worked anyway. We were hoping it wasn't coming up any further. I think they were the only ones willing it to come up, but we certainly had those incidences, and certainly at which you proved too. We had an enormous, nice big bank that sort of was on the side of the road too. So Camille, perhaps we might go into your next question for you, and then come back to Dan. What is the system for real-time monitoring for river flows and groundwater levels and reservoir capacities across the catchment? How quickly can this data be integrated into decision-making processes during a flood?
Yeah, so what we have across the upper catchments is there's a series of rain gauges that real-time rain gauges, and also there's a series of river level gauges as well across our river systems. So the Bureau they're the ones that do the predictions. And at the moment, they only provide predictions to Charlton and Donald. And it's actually, since it's only a new product, that they're actually starting to predict to what could happen in Donald. And Charlton, they've obviously updated Charlton as well. So a big problem with Charlton back in 2011 is the gauge that we rely on for Charlton at Yarwong Weir stopped recording because it was such a big flood. So upstream now there's another gauge that's been put on, but obviously we rely, that was one big thing we learned from 2011. You've got to rely on the locals as well. You can't rely just on technology. So a lot of that has been factored in ringing in the upstream landowners, hey, is what we're seeing the same as what you're seeing as well? So it's good. And what the Bureau do is they've got access to this information. It gets fed into their models, if you like, and it spits out what that potential level could be. And then what they do is they call us in the Incident Control Centre, who've been speaking to people on ground, both councils and landowners, to say this is what we're hearing on ground and that it matches up with what they're predicting.
Fantastic. Dan, what are some of the other learnings, just reflecting on what Camille has said, what are other learnings we had from the event, and where are we going to now, particularly as we now know the community voice is so important to this and underpinning. We can't always rely entirely on technology. Where are we going to now, and what are the other learnings we've had in speaking with the community?
Yeah, so certainly acknowledgement from council and other road and rail authorities that post decommissioning of the channel system, Joe, we've got drainage infrastructure where it's pointless, and we've got no infrastructure where it should be. So the flood studies and updated LiDAR survey that Camille touched on is crucial to informing council and other authorities such as Department of Transport on where the water now runs and where the water should run. So that's really important, and that obviously feeds into any mitigation plans that the catchment authority have, but it also ultimately informs our municipal emergency management plan, which is really the key document that our incident control and all agencies rely on during a flood. So we've got to make sure as a council we've got the most accurate information possible in that plan in the case that we have a big rain again. When it comes to dealing with community, where we are, as a small resource poor council, we would be lost without them. And the reality is without community's help, we can't respond to any event of this nature. And that was proven both in the communities of Donald and Charlton, but also in the communities of Witchy-Proof and Colgoa, with the ground level community organising, even to get meetings organised for myself, for Camille. All that work on the run that's put together really quickly by community, by volunteers, is all crucial to our response. And the planning that's about that will take place over the next 12 months, certainly subject to funding, Camille, we'll need that buy-in. We'll need that buy-in, and we'll be having multiple conversations with the same communities, and that can be very frustrating, Joe. So we're going to we're trying to be a bit of a one-stop shop when we're speaking to communities, because we understand we're talking to the same people a lot, and that volunteer fatigue is real. But certainly, the better prepared we are for the future, we'll rely heavily on our small communities.
Absolutely, Dan. Camille, so just following on from that, what kind of role can the CMA play, and how do you go about now updating your risk models, your floodplain maps, and looking at your management strategies? Where will there be some opportunity for the community to have input to this process with the catchment authority?
There's funding that's becoming available to update these flood models, and as Dan pointed out before, the key thing is that we've got a lot of flood data in the Buloke Shire, but it's relying on information that's at least land level information that's at least 10 years old, in some places 20 years old, And obviously a lot's happened since then. There's been so much channel decommissioning. So, what we were thinking would happen out in the rural areas was a lot different to what actually happened on ground. And the stories from the locals tell us that in some places the flooding was worse than it was in January 2011, even though, it was a smaller flood event. So those things all need to be worked. So what we'll be doing is working with council to help get some funding so that these models can be updated and we can look at these impacts. And then also look at, places like Charlton's got some good flood information. The community was pretty divided on whether a levee should be built around the town, but, are there other things to, as we've seen in that last flood event, are there things that we can do to formalise and to reduce the frequency of flooding in Charlton and make it a lot better? So lots of opportunities, and obviously we'll be working with council to get some funding so that, these models can be updated and test whether things would work so that council can apply for funding to implement in the future. And as Dan said before, there might be a lot of volunteer fatigue, but, I encourage landowners, if they've really got something that they think needs to be improved, stick with it. I mean, the Charlton St Arnaud Road, though, that floodway with culverts, if it wasn't for some key locals and the late Bill Clifford, absolute gentleman, I don't know if you knew him at the time, but he was just a marvellous man. And he just said, well, my dear, we've got to do something about this. And he just stuck with it and didn't give up. And the funding, it just seems so minor in the scheme of things, but geez, heck, it made a lot of a difference. So just encourage the locals, if there's something you really think needs to be fixed, stick with it, work with us to get the funding.
Camille, Dan mentioned the word LIDAR. Can you explain to us, just to understand exactly what that might look like? What does it actually do?
Yeah, well, LIDAR, it's a form of land level survey. So rather than surveyors going out with levels, it's a plane flying at a constant height. It shoots laser beams down and it bounces off the surface. So it's a really effective way of getting a lot of land level information over a big area. Now, obviously, Paddock is a very big area, so you couldn't have surveyors go out and survey the whole thing. So this is a form of survey. So it's not as accurate as a surveyor going outside, but it's not far off. So it picks up all the changes in land. So it picks up the channels, it picks up, where there's banks being built, and it picks up also just the natural level. So that can be used. It's not a flood study itself, but it's the key component of a flood study because it's the land.
That's a great explanation, and any new information or any is always very useful. Dan, and would you like to just continue about the importance of other information we can feed in? We know that we actually utilised some helicopters. The VicPol were fantastic in flying over some of our key areas this time. And so just to let our community know that we're not rigid in terms of the information that we're seeking. We look for all opportunities to get the best information where we can. Can you tell us a little bit more about what we did this time around?
Yeah, so certainly we relied heavily on VicPol, and Sergeant Roberta Barry was really incredible helping us there, putting planes in the air, particularly in the areas, I guess, not recognised as much for flooding. So certainly the area between Birchup and Sea Lake has been drastically affected by the decommissioning of the channel system, and we had large masses of water effectively trapped on private and public land in between those two towns, and Roberta, and resources were obviously quite thin on the ground, or thin in the air, fair to say, Joe, because by that stage Echuca was well and truly under a lot of pressure. So it was really helpful that they were able to get the planes in the air, which really is just another source of information being fed back into that incident controller. Because it's not that they don't believe you, but they're in a room in Bendigo or Swan Hill, and Daniel McLaughlin from the Bullock Shire Council, and you got to remember a lot of the incident controllers were being flown in from other states to relieve the local ones. So they get some random council guy ring and say, you've got to cut this road I've been talking to 6 locals and we need to cut this road, otherwise 3 houses are going to go without that sort of extra information and planes in the air. Then really it becomes a bit of a guessing game. So I think post, one thing that we've had we've had some conversation with, certainly the BOM around information gathering, is we've obviously got member groups like the Birch Cropping Group that have got a lot of members, and a lot of them have digital rain gauges. So trying to, without reinventing the wheel, trying to collate some of that information so it can be fed back in on the run to people like Camille, where to do that sort of, I guess, fact checking from the desktop or the river heights. It's certainly something that we'll work on as part of our planning. Try and get everyone with the knowledge at the table at the same time, Joe.
It sounds like it's all going to come together, and that means our community needs to come together. We were so grateful for you to coming in today, Camille. They will get to have a look at what you look like. So when you're walking down the street in Charlton, Donald, Witchy Proof, Sea Lake, Colgoa, and maybe in Birchup, they're probably going to wave and say hello to Camille. Thank you again for coming in today and sharing some of that information with us. And, of course, Dan McLaughlin, thank you for giving up your time. We know that you're very short of time too. Thank you very much for coming in today. All righty, stay with us and we'll be back for the next round of the Paddock the Goals.